This is what Thomas Jefferson saw from Monticello. The view as perfect as his high ideals.
Some lies do not stay buried, and this one waited 200 years inside a man's blood before it finally clawed its way back into the light. A carpenter in Ohio told the truth in 1873, and the most powerful historians in America looked him dead in the eye and called him a liar. No one knew that more than a century later, a strand of DNA would prove every single word he spoke about Thomas Jefferson was true, and that his proof would tear the Founding Fathers' family apart in ways nobody saw coming. What the descendants are still fighting over right now. There is a private organization called the Monticello Association. For generations, it has done one quiet thing. It keeps the family tree of Thomas Jefferson. It holds the reunions on his mountaintop, and it guards the right to be buried in the graveyard where the man himself lies under Virginia soil. To get in, you simply have to prove your blood goes back to Thomas Jefferson. That is the whole rule. Prove the blood, claim the name, take your place at the table. Then science proved that one whole branch of the family had the blood, and the table got pulled away. In the year 2002, the members of that association gathered, and they took a vote. The question in front of them was whether the descendants of Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who lived and died on that same mountain, would be allowed full membership in the family that shared their DNA. The vote was not close. The most widely reported count was 74 against, 6 in favor. They did not just say no to membership. They moved to limit how many of these cousins could even attend the reunions, and they fought to keep them out of the burial ground where their own ancestor sleeps. Now, here is the part that still makes my skin crawl when I read the records. According to reporting from the Associated Press and from Time magazine, the wife of the association's own president got into the Hemings family's private online discussion group by pretending to be a 67-year-old descendant of slaves. She sat in that group reading their private messages and passing them back to her husband, who used what she found to tighten the rules and keep the cousins out. That happened in our lifetime, not in 1800, not before the Civil War. In the early 2000s, with email and lawyers and a museum gift shop down the road, one of the white descendants who actually fought to let his black cousins in was a novelist and West Point graduate named Lucian Truscott IV. For standing up, he was frozen out by members of his own bloodline. He later said it was the clearest proof of racism he had ever seen inside his own family. So, before we go anywhere near the science, I need you to sit with this. The DNA has been settled for more than 2 decades. The museum that runs Monticello accepted the truth a quarter century ago. And yet, the family itself, the blood relatives, still could not bring themselves to fully open the door. When you understand why that door stayed shut, you understand the whole country. Because to understand how a family fights this hard to keep cousins out, you first have to meet the woman they were trying to erase, and you have to understand that she was never a stranger to them at all. The wife, the sister, and the blood they shared. Most people picture Sally Hemings as some outsider who appeared in Thomas Jefferson's life from nowhere. That is not what happened, and the truth is far stranger and far more uncomfortable. Sally Hemings was the half-sister of Jefferson's own wife. Let me walk you through how that is even possible, because the moment it clicks, this entire story changes shape. There was a wealthy Virginia planter named John Wales. He was a lawyer and a slave trader, and he had a white daughter named Martha. Martha grew up, married a tall, red-haired lawyer named Thomas Jefferson, and became the great love of his life. But John Wales also fathered children with an enslaved woman he owned named Elizabeth Hemings, the woman everyone called Betty. One of those children was a girl named Sally. So Martha Jefferson and Sally Hemings had the same father. One was born free and white and became the wife of a founding father. The other was born into slavery as that man's property. Same blood, same father, 2 completely different worlds, divided by nothing but the status of the women who carried them. There is a brutal old law underneath all of this, and you need to know its name to understand everything that follows. It was called partus sequitur ventrem, which is Latin meaning that the child follows the womb. It meant a baby's freedom did not come from the father, it came only from the mother. So even though Sally's father was a free white man, and even though she herself was 3/4 European by blood, she was born enslaved simply because her mother was enslaved. The law made sure of it. On the 6th of September in 1782, Martha Jefferson died. She was only 33 years old, worn out after giving birth to her 6th child. Witnesses said Thomas Jefferson collapsed at her bedside and had to be carried from the room, and that for weeks afterward he could barely function. There is a story passed down through the household, told by the overseer and by an enslaved man named Israel, that on her deathbed, Martha begged her husband never to marry again, so that no stepmother would ever rule over her children. He kept that promise. He never did remarry, but there was someone already living in that house. Sally Hemings was about 9 years old when Martha died, and the only physical description we have of her comes from a man named Isaac, who was enslaved at Monticello and who knew her. He remembered her as mighty near white, very handsome, with long, straight hair down her back. Think about what that means in that house. The grieving widower had under his own roof a girl who carried his dead wife's father's blood, who reportedly resembled her, and whom the law said he owned. For a few years, she was just a child in the household. Then Jefferson was sent across an ocean, and Sally Hemings was sent after him. And in a city far from Virginia, she discovered something she had never had in her life. She discovered that she could simply walk away and be free. And what she did with that power is the part of this story that almost nobody tells you. The deal she made in Paris. In 1787, Thomas Jefferson was living in Paris as the American minister to France. His youngest daughter needed to cross the Atlantic to join him, and the family chose a 14-year-old Sally Hemings to travel with her as a companion. Her older brother James was already there, training in the kitchens of Paris to become a French chef, learning pastry in the household of a prince, and running the cooking at the American residence. Here is what neither of them could have known when that ship landed. France was not Virginia. Under French law, there was something people called the freedom principle. Any enslaved person who set foot on French soil could go to court and petition for their freedom, and those petitions were granted. Standing in that city, both Sally and James Hemings were, for the first time in their lives, legally able to become free people. All they had to do was ask. Sit with how enormous that was. A teenage girl who had been born as property suddenly held the key to her own cage in her hand. She stayed in Paris for 2.5 years. She learned to speak French. And somewhere in that time, by her own son's account, the relationship between her and Thomas Jefferson began, and she became pregnant. She was 16 years old, free on French soil, and carrying the child of one of the most powerful American men in all of Europe. Then Jefferson packed up to sail home to Virginia, where she would once again be a slave. And this is where Sally Hemings did the thing that should make us see her completely differently. She refused to go. Her son Madison told the story decades later in plain and specific words. His mother understood that she was free in France and that returning to Virginia meant returning to chains. So she said no. To get her to come back, Jefferson made her a promise. He gave her what her son described as extraordinary privileges, and he made a solemn pledge that every child she bore would be set free at the age of 21. Her son did not call this a romance, and he did not call it a surrender. He called it a treaty, like the kind nations sign. A 16-year-old girl, standing free in the most powerful diplomat's house, negotiated the future freedom of children who had not even been born yet. It was the only leverage she would ever have, and she used every bit of it. I want to ask you something honestly, because I keep turning it over in my own head. When you strip away 200 years of myth, what do you call what she did in that room? Was it survival? Was it the coldest, bravest piece of strategy you have ever heard? Or is it something we do not even have a clean word for? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely do not think there is one right answer. She came home. She kept her side of the treaty, and over the next 30 years and more, she bore at least 6 children inside the walls of Monticello, with 4 surviving to grow up. The arrangement stayed hidden and private and almost invisible to the outside world, and it might have stayed that way forever, a quiet secret kept inside a famous house. If one bitter and broken man had not decided to set the president's reputation on fire in front of the entire nation. The journalist who lit the fuse. On the 1st of September in 1802, Thomas Jefferson was the sitting president of the United States, and a journalist named James Callender published a story in a Richmond newspaper that hit American politics like a hammer. Callender was not some random reporter. He had once been Jefferson's own attack dog. He had savaged Jefferson's political enemies. He had gone to federal prison for his pro-Jefferson writing, and when Jefferson won the presidency, Callender expected his reward. He wanted to be made the postmaster of Richmond. Jefferson said no. So Callender reached for the most poisonous weapon he had. He told the country, in print, that the man the people loved to honor kept one of his own slaves as his concubine. He printed her name in capital letters. Her name was Sally. He wrote that the president had fathered several children by her, and in the weeks that followed, he kept hammering, mocking the children's skin and the president's silence, even putting the scandal to song. The story spread like fire through dry grass. Jefferson's political enemies reprinted it with glee. Ballads were written to humiliate him. And through all of it, Thomas Jefferson did the one thing that the powerful so often do when the truth is dangerous. He said absolutely nothing. He never confirmed it, and he never denied it. He simply went silent and let the storm pass over him. The man who lit the fuse did not last long. Less than a year later, in July of 1803, James Callender was found drowned in 3 feet of water in the James River. His accusations, though, did not drown with him. They lived on as an unproven rumor, a stain that hung over the family for generations. And here is where the family made their move. With Callender dead and the president silent, Jefferson's own white descendants began to build a defense, a careful counter-story that they would defend for the next 200 years. It was clever, it was specific, and it had one fatal flaw hiding inside it that they could never have predicted. Because the very thing that made their lie convincing in 1800 was the exact thing that would one day blow it apart. The cover story with a crack in it. The defense the family settled on was simple and almost elegant. Yes, they admitted, Sally Hemings had children with white fathers, but it was not Thomas Jefferson. It was his nephews. Jefferson had 2 nephews, Peter and Samuel Carr, young men who spent time at Monticello. The family pointed at them and said, "There are your fathers, not the great man, the nephews." It was a tidy answer. It admitted the obvious, that these children were clearly part white, while protecting the reputation of the founding father at the center of it all. For a century and a half, it worked. The most respected Jefferson biographers in America repeated it. One of them won the Pulitzer Prize and still waved away the testimony of Sally's own son as unreliable. The reason they gave was never said out loud, but it was not hard to see. Madison Hemings was a black man making a claim about America's most beloved white president, and in the world of those scholars, his word simply did not carry weight against the word of Jefferson's white grandchildren. But here is the crack that was sitting in the cover story the entire time, the detail that should have been the first warning sign. Jefferson's white grandchildren could not agree on which nephew did it. One of them swore it was Peter Carr. The other swore it was Samuel Carr. If your family truly had inside knowledge of who fathered these children, you would all name the same man. They did not. They named 2 different brothers, and nobody pressed them on it. For 200 years, that contradiction sat in the record, ignored, waiting. While the white family was building this defense, something else was quietly happening. Thomas Jefferson kept his treaty. He freed Sally Hemings's children, and he freed almost no one else. Across his entire life, Thomas Jefferson owned more than 600 human beings. When he died, deep in debt, the overwhelming majority of them were sold to pay his creditors, their families torn apart on the auction block. But the children of Sally Hemings walked free. They were, with the smallest handful of exceptions, the only enslaved family he ever released. The overseer remembered putting one of Sally's daughters on a stagecoach with $50 in her hand and a ticket north because, as people whispered, she was the master's own child. Ask yourself why a man would single out one woman's children out of 600 souls and free those and almost only those. The family had an answer for the children's faces. They never had a clean answer for that. Two of those freed children did something with their freedom that turns this from a scandal into something far stranger and far more haunting. They did not just walk away from slavery. They walked away from being black at all. The children who disappeared into white America. Beverly Hemings and Harriet Hemings were Sally's older children, and both of them were so light-skinned that they could pass as white. So in the 1820s, that is exactly what they did. Beverly left Monticello and walked into the city of Washington and lived the rest of his life as a white man. Harriet married a white man of good standing in the same city. Their own brother said they simply stepped across the color line and never stepped back. As far as the historical record is concerned, two of Thomas Jefferson's children vanished into white society as though they had never been born. But it is the youngest son whose story I cannot stop thinking about because his family carried the secret the longest and buried it the deepest. His name was Eston Hemings, born in 1808. Jefferson freed him in his will. He grew up to be a gifted musician, a violinist who led a band, and he moved his family to Ohio to live as a free man. Look at how the world could not even decide what he was. One census taker wrote him down as white. Another, looking at the same man, wrote him down as mulatto. He existed in the cruel gray space in between, where the law could change its mind about your humanity depending on who was holding the pen. Then, in 1850, the country passed the Fugitive Slave Act, a law so vicious that it allowed slave catchers to grab free black people off the street and drag them south into slavery. For a free family with dark history in their blood, Ohio was no longer safe enough. So, in 1852, Eston made a decision that would erase his family's identity for more than 100 years. He moved them all to Wisconsin. He changed the family name from Hemings to Jefferson, and he led his entire family across the color line into white America, and they never looked back. His oldest son took the secret into one of the bloodiest chapters in American history. That son's name was John Wales Jefferson, and he ran a hotel in Wisconsin until the Civil War broke out. He enlisted in an all-white regiment, and he was a brave soldier. He rose from major to lieutenant colonel to full colonel. He was wounded. He led men through the brutal siege of Vicksburg. And during that war, somewhere in the chaos, John ran into a man from his old life in Ohio who knew the family's secret, who knew they had once been counted as people of color. And the grandson of a president and an enslaved woman begged that man to stay quiet. He pleaded with him not to reveal that he had what he called colored blood in his veins, blood that he said was not suspected by anyone in his entire command. Think about the weight of carrying that. A commander leading white Union soldiers in a war fought in part over whether people like his own grandmother deserved to be free, lying awake terrified that one wrong word would expose who he really was. He survived the war, moved south, and became a wealthy cotton broker. He died a rich white man. He never married, perhaps because marriage and children meant the risk of a baby born too dark, a baby who could give the whole secret away. His descendants had no idea what ran in their blood, not until a retired doctor in Virginia decided to test it. The blood that could not lie. In the late 1990s, a retired pathologist named Eugene Foster set out to do something that 200 years of arguing could never do. He decided to ask the blood itself, The science he used is beautifully simple once you understand it. There is a piece of DNA called the Y chromosome that passes down almost completely unchanged from father to son to grandson, generation after generation, like a signature handed down a male line. If Thomas Jefferson had truly fathered Sally Hemings's sons, then the male descendants of those sons should carry the Jefferson Y chromosome signature in their cells, hidden but unmistakable, more than a century and a half later. There was one problem. Thomas Jefferson had no surviving sons through his marriage to test, so Foster found a clever way around it. He tracked down living male descendants of Jefferson's paternal uncle, men who would carry the very same Jefferson Y chromosome. Then he found a male line descendant of Eston Hemings, Sally's youngest son. And, crucially, he found descendants of the Carr nephews, the two men the family had blamed for 200 years. He compared their genetic markers and waited for the answer. The results were published in one of the most respected scientific journals on Earth in November of 1998, and the answer was devastating in its clarity. The Jefferson line and the descendant of Eston Hemings carried the same rare genetic signature. It was a match. And this was no ordinary signature. The researchers found that this particular pattern had never been seen anywhere outside the Jefferson family, not in hundreds and hundreds of other men they tested. The odds of it being a random coincidence were staggeringly small. Then came the part that destroyed the cover story for good. The Carr descendants, the nephews the family had blamed for 2 centuries, did not match at all. Not a partial match, not a close one, nothing. The lie the White family had defended since 1802 crumbled in a single laboratory result. The nephews did not do it. The blood said so. The DNA proved that a Jefferson man fathered Eston Hemings. It could not, by itself, point to Thomas specifically rather than some other Jefferson male who shared that Y chromosome. So you will sometimes hear people seize on that gap and say it could have been a brother or a cousin. But look at what the gap cannot explain away. Thomas Jefferson, and not some traveling relative, was documented at Monticello around 9 months before every single one of Sally's 6 children was born. The relationship lasted decades, with one consistent pattern, not a string of different men. And out of more than 600 people he owned, Thomas Jefferson is the one who freed Sally's children, exactly as the treaty in Paris promised. When you stack the genetics on top of the records, on top of the freedoms, the picture stops being a mystery and starts being a confession written in 3 different hands. The museum foundation that runs Monticello studied all of it and reached the same conclusion. There was, in their careful words, a strong likelihood that Thomas Jefferson fathered one and probably all of Sally Hemings's children. A carpenter named Madison Hemings had told that exact truth back in 1873, and for 125 years, America had called him a liar. The bones finally proved that every word he spoke was true, and that brings us all the way back to where we started, to a family vote and a locked graveyard gate, and to a question that science could not answer, no matter how clean the result. The truth was settled, but the family was not here, is what the DNA could never do. It could prove the blood, but it could not force the heart to follow. The science was finished. The museum had spoken. And still, when the descendants of Sally Hemings asked to take their place in the family, the answer from the Monticello Association was the vote we opened with, the spying, the fight over the burial ground, the door held shut by relatives who shared their ancestor. But I do not want to leave you only with the ugliness, because that is not the whole truth either. There were people on the white side of the family who looked at their black cousins and saw nothing but family. When Lucian Truscott IV first met his Hemings cousins, he invited them straight onto the grounds of Monticello, and for the first time in history, they walked through the halls their ancestors had built, not as servants, but as kin. One descendant of Sally Hemings put it in a way I have never been able to forget. She said that all of a sudden she had this enormous black family who opened their arms and embraced her, and that she had learned family has nothing to do with color. Another said simply that being part of Jefferson's family was a done deal, and there was nothing anyone could do to remove them from it, because their mothers had told them who they were long before any scientist confirmed it. And the place itself has finally started telling the truth. In 2018, Monticello opened an exhibit dedicated to the life of Sally Hemings, built inside a small room in the south wing of the house where she most likely once lived. Here is the detail that I think says everything about how this country buried her. For roughly half a century before that exhibit, the very room where Sally Hemings raised the children of a president had been converted into a public men's restroom, the walls covered in bathroom tile. They tore out the tile and gave her back her room. There is no portrait of her anywhere on earth, so they tell her story entirely through the words of her son, the carpenter nobody believed. Now, as I record this, America is marking 250 years since Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. There is a brand new quarter in circulation with his face on it, and somewhere in your pocket or your car or the bottom of a drawer, there is probably a coin carrying the image of a man who declared liberty for a nation and denied it to the woman who bore his children and to 4 of those children themselves. So this is what I keep coming back to, and I want to hand it to you now. The man who wrote those famous words built 2 families on that mountain, one free and one enslaved. And for 200 years, this country pretended only one of them ever existed. The science has settled the blood. The question that is left is the one no laboratory can answer, and it belongs to us. Are we finally honest enough to hold both of those families in the same hand, the words he wrote and the life he actually lived? I would love to hear where you land on this, so tell me in the comments what you felt as the truth came out, and whether you think this family will ever truly be whole. If this opened your eyes to a history that was nearly buried, you already know what to do, because here at Stone and Bone, we always go to the place where the records end and the blood begins.